My daughter-in-law had cornered herself, and she didn't even realize it until the envelope was already torn open. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold the piece of expensive, gold-foiled cardstock. Behind her, in a living room packed with 30 of our closest relatives, end quote. The festive holiday music suddenly felt like a joke. Everyone had gone completely, utterly silent. My sister-in-law, Margaret, was standing near the fireplace, holding two distinctly different versions of the exact same Christmas family portrait. In one photograph, we were a family. In the other, a glaring, poorly retouched void of fake brick and cloned wallpaper sat exactly where I was supposed to be. Clara looked at me. Her face was completely drained of color. Just 10 minutes prior, she had been floating through the room, pouring champagne, basking in the glow of what she thought was her perfect, curated evening. Now, she was waiting for the screaming to start. She was waiting for me to destroy her, right there in front of everyone who mattered to her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point a finger. I didn't do anything at all. I just watched her perfectly filtered world crumble under the absolute, undeniable weight of a single, unedited raw file. To understand how we ended up in this freezing, silent room, I need to take you back exactly 1 year. But before we get into the dark room of this family's history, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are tuning in from today. I always love seeing where this community is gathered from. My name is Adeline. I am 67 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a senior photo editor for one of the largest newswires in the country. My entire professional life was dedicated to the absolute truth of an image. I spent my days in darkened rooms, looking at the world through a magnifying loupe, hunting for the things people tried to hide. I know exactly how light falls. I know how shadows behave when a living, breathing body is standing in a room. And more importantly, I know exactly what it looks like when someone tries to erase a truth they simply do not want to look at. A photograph is just a frozen second of reality. You can crop it. You can adjust the contrast to make things look brighter than they really are. But the underlying data, the raw truth of who was in the room and who was not, never actually goes away. It just waits to be uncovered. I applied that same exact principle to my family. I built a life with my late husband that was messy, loud, and entirely real. We were not perfect, but we were there. I still remember the very specific, sharp smell of the stop bath and developer fluid from my early days in the industry. Before everything went digital, before you could erase a person with the casual swipe of a glowing screen, the truth of a photograph was born in the dark. I would stand in a room bathed entirely in the dull glow of a red safe light. Surrounded by shallow trays of chemicals, you slide the blank photographic paper into the liquid, and you wait. You don't force it. You just rock the tray gently, back and forth, and watch as the shadows begin to bloom first. Then the midtones, then the highlights. The reality of a frozen second in time slowly reveals itself to you. It was like watching a ghost become solid. That was where I learned my trade. I learned that you cannot rush the truth, and you cannot easily hide it once it has been captured on a negative. People often misunderstand what a senior photo editor for a major newswire actually does. They think my job was to make things look pretty. They think I was sitting at a desk, trying to make the sky look a little bluer, or making sure everyone in the frame was smiling. That wasn't my job at all. My job was the exact opposite. My job was to look at thousands of images coming in from all over the world, images of war, images of triumph, images of devastating grief, and ensure that absolutely nothing had been tampered with. I looked for the things people tried to hide. I hunted for manipulated shadows. I checked the grain of the film to see if something had been spliced in or taken out. If a photographer altered an image to make a scene look more dramatic, or removed a person to clean up the composition. I was the one who caught them. I was the one who rejected the photo. Because the moment you start erasing the messy parts of reality just to make a prettier picture, you stop telling the truth. You start telling a lie. I carried that exact same philosophy into my own home. When I married my husband, Arthur, we didn't have much money. We didn't have a perfectly curated aesthetic. Our first apartment had a hideous, bright orange sofa that we bought at a estate sale for $40. The plates in our kitchen cabinets didn't match. The paint on the trim was chipping, but it was ours. It was a loud, chaotic, deeply authentic life. Arthur was a man who understood the beauty of the unedited world. He didn't care about impressing the neighbors. He didn't care about keeping up appearances. If we had a bad day, we had a bad day. If the house was a mess because we spent the entire Sunday afternoon reading on that terrible orange sofa instead of cleaning, we didn't apologize if someone dropped by unexpectedly. We just offered them a cup of coffee and cleared a stack of magazines off a chair so they could sit down. When our son, David, was born, we raised him in that exact same environment. I wanted David to grow up knowing that love isn't a performance. Family isn't something you put in a display case to be admired by strangers. Family is the people who see you when your hair is a mess, when you are exhausted, when you have burned the dinner, and who sit down at the table to eat the burnt dinner with you anyway. For the first 18 years of his life, David understood that he was a kind boy, a grounded boy. He didn't care about designer clothes or driving a fancy car. He cared about the substance of things, not the surface. When Arthur passed away 10 years ago, that authentic foundation we built is what saved me. I didn't try to hide my grief. I didn't put on a brave face and pretend everything was fine. I let my house fall into a mess. I let myself be entirely, visibly broken, and David was right there with me, sitting on a mismatched chair in my living room, holding my hand while we navigated the darkest season of our lives together. We survived because we never tried to edit out the pain. We just lived through it. But the world has changed since those days in the dark room. The world has shifted into a place where the image of a perfect life is somehow considered more valuable than actually living a good one. People don't want the messy reality anymore. They want the smooth, filtered, spotless illusion. And sadly, somewhere along the line, as my son moved up in his career and expanded his social circles, that hunger for the perfect illusion began to seep into his life. I didn't see the shift happening immediately. It was gradual, a slow fade. It started with small things. The way he dressed, the way he talked about the people he wanted to impress, the way he began to view his own history, not as a foundation, but as something that perhaps needed a little bit of polishing. I didn't realize just how much he had changed until the day he brought Clara home for the very first time. She was beautiful. She was sharp, and she was absolutely terrified of anything that wasn't picture perfect. David was 29 years old when he brought Clara to my house for the very first time. It was a brisk Sunday evening in early November. I remember the exact quality of the light coming through the living room windows. It was that sharp, unforgiving autumn light that cuts across the floorboards and highlights every single speck of dust in the air. I had been cooking all afternoon. I made a simple roast chicken with root vegetables. It was the exact same meal I had made for David hundreds of times when he was growing up. The house smelled like rosemary and melting butter. It was warm. It was comfortable. It was loud with the sound of the old radiators hissing in the background. And then Clara walked through the front door. I knew within the first 10 seconds of meeting her that she was going to struggle in our family. I didn't know how badly, and I certainly could never have predicted the absolute disaster she would eventually orchestrate. But my editor's eye caught the friction immediately. She was breathtakingly beautiful. She had dark hair pulled back into a flawless, braided, immaculate style that didn't allow a single strand to fall out of place. She wore a tailored silk blouse that looked completely untouched by the humid, rainy weather outside, and she carried a structured leather handbag that she held tight against her chest, right below her collarbone, exactly like a shield. When David introduced us, she gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a practiced expression, the kind of smile a politician gives a camera. I welcomed her in. I took her coat. I poured us both a glass of red wine. We sat down in the living room on my old, comfortable sofas, and almost immediately, I watched her start to visually inventory the room. Clara came from a background where money was scarce, and appearances were absolutely everything. I learned later that she grew up in a household where the front lawn was kept perfectly manicured while the electricity was constantly being shut off. She was raised to believe that as long as the neighbors thought you were doing well, it didn't matter if you were starving behind closed doors. So, when she walked into my home, the home of a woman who had spent 40 years earning a very substantial salary at a major news organization, she didn't understand what she was looking at. She looked at the mismatched throw pillows. She looked at the stack of paperback books teetering dangerously on the edge of the coffee table. She looked at the deep, visible scratch on the wooden floor near the fireplace where our old dog used to pace back and forth. She saw all of these things, and you could see the absolute confusion washing over her features. She couldn't comprehend why someone who had money wouldn't spend it to make everything look pristine. To her, a scratch on the floor wasn't a memory of a beloved family pet. It was a failure to maintain an image. When we moved to the dining room for dinner, the friction only got worse. I served the food on the everyday plates. We sat around the heavy oak table that Arthur and I had bought secondhand 30 years ago. During the meal, David started telling a very funny, very self-deprecating story about a massive presentation he had completely fumbled at work the week prior. He was laughing. I was laughing. We were a family that found joy in our shared human clumsiness. But Clara went completely rigid. She put her fork down. Her knuckles were white. She immediately interrupted David, her voice high and tight, trying to reframe his story. She started listing his recent promotions. She started telling me about how much money his firm had made that quarter. She aggressively steered the conversation away from his failure and aggressively tried to paint a picture of a flawless, unstoppable corporate winner. She couldn't stand the idea of him admitting a mistake. She didn't want him to be a human being sitting at his mother's table. She wanted him to be a flat, perfect, glossy photograph. I didn't argue with her. I didn't correct her. I just listened. In the dark room, when a photographer exposes a piece of film to far too much light, we call it blowing out the highlights. The image becomes so overwhelmingly bright that all the texture, all the detail, and all the depth just vanish completely. You are left with a blinding, flat expanse of white. That was exactly what Clara was doing to herself and to my son. She was blasting so much artificial light onto their relationship, trying so desperately to make it look flawless to the outside world, that she was destroying all the real texture underneath. I didn't hate her for it. Actually, sitting across from her at that dinner table, watching her constantly readjust her posture and wipe away non-existent smudges from her water glass, I felt a profound sense of sadness for her. It must be absolutely exhausting. I thought to myself, to wake up every single day and perform your life instead of just living it. By the end of the evening, Clara walked out of my house believing she had successfully impressed me. I could see the visible, physical release of tension in her shoulders as David helped her into her coat. She mistook my quiet observation for awe. She believed, with the tragic certainty of someone who has never known true security, that she had proven she was good enough to fit into this family. She had no idea that I wasn't judging her pedigree or her bank account. I was mourning the fact that my son was falling in love with a woman who was terrified of the truth. That was the foundation. That was the quiet, invisible crack in the structure of our family. And over the next 5 years, as social media became the absolute center of Clara's universe, that crack would silently tear us completely apart. Over the next 5 years, that quiet crack in the foundation of our family turned into a massive, silent chasm. David and Clara got married 2 years after that first dinner. The wedding itself was an absolute spectacle. I hardly recognized my own son standing at the altar. He looked like a stiff mannequin in a rented tuxedo, placed exactly where he was told to stand by a very expensive wedding planner. The entire event felt less like a celebration of 2 people starting a life together and more like a heavily directed stage play. I paid for a significant portion of that wedding. I didn't mind doing it. I wanted my son to have a good day. But I noticed very early on that Clara was completely terrified of anything that did not look impeccably wealthy. She hired a photographer who specialized in high-end editorial fashion, not family portraits. I remember watching this poor photographer politely direct my sister-in-law, Margaret, to stand entirely behind a massive floral arrangement simply because the shade of her dress clashed with Clara's chosen pastel color palette. That was the very beginning of the curation. That was the start of Clara deciding who was aesthetically pleasing enough to be seen and who needed to be hidden in the background. When social media truly took over her life, it was like watching a completely different reality overwrite the one we were actually living. For Clara, if a moment was not documented, heavily filtered, and posted online for public consumption, it simply did not happen. Her entire sense of self-worth became permanently tethered to the little glowing notifications on her phone screen. I had spent 40 years editing photographs to ensure they told the unvarnished, factual truth of a situation. Clara was spending every waking hour doing the exact opposite. She was building an elaborate, exhausting lie. It started bleeding into our Sunday dinners. David and Clara would come over to my house, or we would go over to theirs. Their new house, by the way, felt more like a sterile furniture showroom than a place where human beings actually lived and breathed. There was no comfortable clutter. There were no mismatched coffee mugs. Everything was a cold, coordinated shade of gray and white. I remember one specific evening in late October. I had spent 3 hours making a very complicated plate, hearty beef stew. It was an old family recipe that David had loved since he was 7 years old. When I brought the heavy ceramic pot to the dining room table, Clara actually physically blocked me from serving it. She held up her hand, pulled out her phone, and spent the next 20 minutes rearranging the bowls. She moved the salt shaker. She adjusted the overhead lighting. She made David lean in at a completely unnatural, uncomfortable angle, so it looked like they were sharing a spontaneous, romantic moment over a rustic home-cooked meal. By the time we were finally allowed to pick up our spoons, the food was completely cold. David did not complain. He just ate his cold stew and gave me a tired, apologetic smile. He was adapting to her world. He was slowly learning that his actual comfort was always going to be secondary to the projected image of their comfort. I did not say a single word. I did not raise my voice. I did not point out how utterly ridiculous it was to eat cold food in your own home, just so a few hundred strangers on the internet could think you were having a lovely time. I simply sat there, ate my dinner, and observed, in my line of work, You learn very quickly that the most telling part of any photograph is often what happens immediately after the shutter clicks. It is that split second when the subject thinks they are no longer being watched. The mask drops. The posture slumps. The bright, artificial smile vanishes completely. I saw that exact drop in Clara every single time she took a picture. She would smile brilliantly for the lens, and the blank.com, her arm wrapped tightly around David's shoulder, projecting absolute marital bliss. The camera would click, and then, instantly, she would pull away from him. The warmth would completely vanish from her eyes. She would immediately look down at her screen to inspect the result, completely ignoring the living, breathing husband sitting right next to her. She mistook my silence for ignorance. She thought I was just an old, out-of-touch woman who didn't understand how the modern world worked. She truly believed that because I was not actively fighting her on every little staged photo, I was simply submitting to her authority. There was a visible, profound relief in her posture whenever I stepped back and let her take control of the camera. She thought she was winning. But I was not submitting. I was gathering data. I was watching the desperate, fragile architecture of her self-esteem being built on a foundation of absolute sand. I knew it was only a matter of time before she realized that I was the one element in her perfect pictures that she could not control. I am an older woman. I have deep wrinkles around my eyes. I wear comfortable, sensible clothes. I do not fit into a carefully curated, luxury lifestyle aesthetic. I am a reminder of a messy, normal reality that she was desperately trying to escape. And that brings us to the holidays, the time of year when the pressure to present a flawless, unified family image reaches an absolute fever pitch. That was when Clara decided that simply moving me to the edge of the frame was no longer enough. It all started to become aggressively visible during Thanksgiving of last year. That was when Clara decided that managing the environment was no longer enough. She needed to actively manage the historical record of our family. About 3 weeks before the holiday, she sent out a group email. It did not contain a warm greeting. It did not ask what side dishes we might want to bring. It contained a link to a digital mood board and a very strict, highly specific color palette. She wanted everyone in varying shades of cream, beige, and soft gold. She stated that she had hired a professional retoucher for after the fact, but she was going to set up her own high-end camera on a tripod to capture the perfect, candid family moment before dinner. I remember reading that email while sitting at my kitchen table. I just stared at the screen. A curated mood board for a family Thanksgiving. It was so incredibly far removed from the loud, chaotic, gravy-stained holidays Arthur and I used to host that it felt like reading a dispatch from an alien planet. But I played along. I went to a department store. I bought a heavy, beige wool sweater that I did not particularly like. And I showed up to their house at exactly 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. When I walked through the door, the house did not smell like roasting turkey. It smelled like expensive vanilla candles and lemon polish. The food was entirely catered, sitting in perfectly arranged, temperature-controlled chafing dishes in the kitchen. David looked exhausted. He was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that looked entirely too tight across his shoulders. And he was holding a glass of scotch like it was a life preserver. In the center of the living room, standing like a weapon, was Clara's camera. It was mounted on a heavy, professional-grade tripod. She had set up 2 massive, artificial light panels on either side of the fireplace. She had literally turned their living room into a sterile photography studio. Before anyone was even allowed to sit down or get a drink, Clara clapped her hands together. Her voice was high, tight, and completely breathless with a frantic kind of energy. She announced that we were doing the photos immediately, before anyone got wrinkled or spilled anything. She corralled us all toward the fireplace. There were 12 of us in total: David, Clara, myself, my sister-in-law Margaret, and a few other close aunts and uncles. Now, I spent 40 years of my life analyzing composition. I know how a group of people should naturally arrange themselves to look like a cohesive unit. You look for balance. You look for connection. You want the physical proximity of the bodies to reflect the emotional proximity of the relationships. Clara did not want balance. Clara wanted a hierarchy. She placed herself and David dead center. That was expected. But then she began to physically move the rest of us around like we were inanimate props. She asked Margaret to stand to the right. She moved an uncle to the left. And then she turned to me. She gave me that brilliant, entirely hollow smile. She put her hands on my shoulders and physically guided me to the absolute far left edge of the group. Not just to the edge, but slightly behind a massive, incredibly ugly decorative ceramic vase that she had placed on a pedestal. I was wearing beige. The wall behind me was beige. I was positioned in the furthest corner of the frame, half obscured by a piece of pottery, in a room flooded with flat, artificial light. She was trying to make me disappear into the background. She stepped back. She looked at the monitor connected to the camera. I watched her eyes dart across the screen, calculating the visual weight of the image. "Could you just take half a step back, Ottiline?" she asked. Her voice was dripping with a sickly sweet patronizing tone. "You are just casting a tiny bit of a shadow on David's shoulder. I want the light to be perfect." I knew exactly what she was doing. Half a step back would put me entirely out of the focal plane. I would be slightly blurry. I would be visually disconnected from the rest of my own family. I did not argue. I did not cause a scene. I did not tell her that her artificial lighting setup was amateurish and flat. I simply took the half step backward. Clara picked up the remote trigger. She wrapped her arm tightly around David. She threw her head back in a perfectly practiced laugh, entirely for the benefit of the lens. The camera clicked. A burst of blinding light filled the room. The moment the flash faded, she dropped her arm from David. She walked immediately over to the monitor to inspect the image. I watched her face from across the room. I saw the immediate, profound wave of relief wash over her features. She looked at the screen, and she saw exactly what she wanted to see: a flawless, glossy, wealthy-looking couple in the center, and a faded, blurry, beige ghost of a mother-in-law pushed entirely out of focus on the periphery. She turned around and looked at me. She truly believed, with absolute certainty, that I had no idea what had just happened. She thought I was just a tired old woman who didn't understand technology, who didn't understand the power of an image. She mistook my quiet compliance for ignorance. She thought she had won. For the rest of the evening, she was incredibly sweet to me. It was the condescending, magnanimous sweetness of someone who believes they have completely neutralized a threat. She kept offering me water. She kept asking if I was comfortable on the sofa. She treated me not like a mother, but like a fragile, irrelevant antique that had been safely tucked away in a dusty corner. I sat on her uncomfortable, pristine gray sofa. I ate the catered turkey. I watched my son slowly drink 3 glasses of scotch, and I waited for the holiday cards to arrive in the mail. Because I knew, with the cold, absolute certainty of a professional editor, that pushing me to the edge of the frame was only her first draft. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of December. I found it sitting in my mailbox, mixed in with the usual grocery store circulars and utility bills. It was a heavy, square envelope, the kind of expensive, textured paper that costs $4 or $5 a piece to print. My address was written in a faux calligraphy font. Perfectly centered. I brought it inside, walked into my kitchen, and slid my thumb under the sealed flap. When you spend 4 decades of your life looking at photographs, you do not just see faces. You see geometry. You see the deliberate choices the photographer made about what to include within the 4 walls of that frame, and what to leave out. Your eye is instantly drawn to the balance of the composition. I pulled the card out of the envelope, and the lack of balance hit me like a physical blow. There was David in the center, looking handsome but incredibly stiff in his tight cashmere sweater. There was Clara, leaning into him, her face radiating that practiced, flawless, artificial joy she saved entirely for the camera. The lighting was flat and bright, making them look like a pair of models in a catalog for luxury home goods. And then, on the absolute far left edge of the heavy cardstock, there was me. Except, it was not really me. It was only half of me. Clara had cropped the image, but it was a cowardly, hesitant kind of crop. She had not yet developed the absolute nerve required to erase me entirely. She wanted me gone. But she was still too afraid of what David might say if I simply vanished from the family photo. So, she compromised. She zoomed the image in, shifting the center point squarely onto herself and David. In doing so, the rigid, vertical edge of the physical card sliced right down the middle of my body, my left shoulder, arm, and half of my face were completely severed from the frame. I was pushed so far into the margin that I looked like a stranger who had accidentally stumbled into the background of a private photo shoot. I looked like a mistake. I did not throw the card away. I walked over to my refrigerator, took a small magnet, and pinned the photograph right at eye level. I stood there in my quiet kitchen, drinking my coffee, and I just studied it. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I knew she would not just let it sit there. A lie that size requires maintenance. Sure enough, 2 days later, the phone rang. It was Clara. She did not even say hello. She just launched immediately into a breathless, highly rehearsed preemptive strike. Ottoline. Did you get the card in the mail today? She asked. Her voice was pitched a little too high, dripping with a manufactured, frantic innocence. I am just so furious. I have been on the phone with the printing company all morning. They completely messed up the aspect ratio. I gave them very specific instructions, and they just printed it wrong and ruined the margins. I cannot believe they cropped you right out on the edge like that. It is just terrible. I am so sorry. I stood in my kitchen, looking directly at the card on my refrigerator. I spent 40 years dealing with professional imaging and commercial printing. I know exactly how bleed lines work. I know what a print proof looks like. Professional printing companies do not make independent, creative decisions to amputate the mother of the groom from a family portrait. They print the exact digital file they are given. The file she uploaded was already cropped. She had done it herself. On her computer, dragging the digital border over my face until she felt the picture was perfect. And now? She was blaming an anonymous technician for her own deliberate action. I could have ended it right there. I could have asked her what file format she sent them. I could have calmly explained the mechanics of automated photo printing and watched her stumble over her own words, trying to back out of the corner. But I didn't. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call her a liar. I didn't point out that her excuse was a direct insult to the entire career that had paid for the down payment on the very house she was calling me from. I just took a breath, kept my voice entirely pleasant, and said, "Oh, Clara, please do not worry about it at all. These technical glitches happen all the time. It is a beautiful picture of you and David. The silence on the other end of the line was incredibly telling. It only lasted for about 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, I could practically hear the physical release of tension in her body. I could hear her shoulders drop. She let out a light, breathy, victorious little laugh. You are just so understanding. Ottoline, you know how unpredictable technology is these days. Next year, we will make sure it is absolutely perfect. She mistook my silence for surrender. She thought I was oblivious. She truly believed that I was just a technologically illiterate, fading old woman who simply accepted whatever story she was told. She thought she had successfully established the new visual hierarchy of our family, and that I was completely content to exist as a blurry half-person in the margins of her perfect life. There was a profound, arrogant certainty in her voice. She thought the war was over before it even began, and that she had won without having to fire a single shot. I let her believe it. I let her have her little cropped victory. I said goodbye, hung up the phone, and looked at the half-face staring back at me from the refrigerator. Because if you want to know exactly what a person is capable of, you have to let them think they are not being watched. You have to let them believe they are the smartest person in the room. And so, I waited. I watched her curate her flawless digital life for another 12 months. I watched the fake smiles, the staged dinners, the exhausting performance of it all. I stayed in the background, exactly where she put me, gathering my patience. Because I knew the holidays would come around again, and I knew that this year, pushing me to the edge of the frame would not be enough to satisfy her. This year, she would want me completely gone. A full 12 months went by, an entire year of living in the quiet, sterile margins of my own family. If you have never been slowly, deliberately erased by someone who smiles at you while they do it, it is a very difficult thing to describe. There were no screaming matches. There were no slammed doors. There was just a smooth, calculated, and relentless campaign to rewrite the history of our family so that Clara was the absolute center of it, and I was merely a distant, irrelevant guest. I watched it happen in real time. I watched her curation extend far beyond the borders of a photograph. She started curating our conversations. She started curating our memories. When David's birthday came around in June, I naturally offered to bake the heavy chocolate cake he had loved since he was a little boy. I had baked that exact cake for him for 30 years. But Clara called me 2 days before the party. Her voice was dripping with that same manufactured, breathless sweetness she always used when she was about to cut me out of something. She told me not to worry about the cake. She told me she had already ordered a custom, multi-tiered fondant masterpiece from a high-end bakery downtown. She said it was going to perfectly match the color scheme of the party decorations. When I showed up to the birthday dinner, the cake was beautiful. It looked like a sculpture. It looked completely flawless on her social media feed. But nobody actually ate it. The fondant was thick and tasted like sugary plastic. David took one bite, smiled politely for the camera, and quietly pushed his plate away. That was the theme of the entire year. Everything looked incredibly expensive, and everything tasted completely hollow. I spent those 12 months simply observing. In my career as an editor, I learned that the most dangerous lies are never the loud ones. The most dangerous lies are the ones that are repeated quietly, consistently, day after day, until people simply accept them as the new reality. Clara was building a new reality. In her reality, she was the flawless matriarch of a highly successful, incredibly wealthy young family. And in order for that reality to work, she needed David to be the perfect, compliant husband, and she needed me to be out of the picture. I felt a profound ache for my son during that time. David was working 80 hours a week at his firm just to keep up with the lifestyle Clara demanded. He looked gray. He looked perpetually exhausted. Whenever he came over to my house alone, which was becoming increasingly rare, he would sit on my old orange sofa, close his eyes, and just breathe. He never complained about her. He was too loyal for that. But his silence was incredibly loud. He was slowly losing his texture. He was becoming a flat, two-dimensional version of the vibrant, funny boy I had raised. He was drowning in her artificial light, and he did not even realize it. I knew Clara thought she had completely managed me. She believed that because I did not fight her on the birthday cake, because I did not argue about being cropped out of the Thanksgiving card, I had simply accepted my demotion. She thought I was too tired, too old, or too passive to challenge her authority. There is a specific kind of arrogance that comes from never having been held accountable for your actions. Clara had that arrogance in spades. She walked around her gray, immaculate house with the absolute certainty of a woman who believes she is the smartest person in the room. But she forgot one crucial detail. She forgot what I did for a living for 4 decades. I did not survive in the high-pressure, male-dominated world of international photojournalism by being passive. I survived by being patient. I survived by letting people make their mistakes on the record and collecting the evidence until the exact right moment to present it. I was not surrendering. I was letting her build her house of cards as high as she possibly could. Because the higher she built it, the harder it would fall when someone finally pulled out the bottom card. As the weather turned cold again and November approached, I could feel the familiar, frantic energy starting to radiate from Clara. Her social media following had grown significantly over the past year. She had started receiving free products from luxury home brands in exchange for posting pictures of them. Her online image was no longer just a hobby. It was becoming a business. It was becoming her entire identity. And that meant the stakes for this year's holiday season were astronomically high. I knew that a simple, clumsy crop on a digital printing file would not be enough for her this time. Last year, she was just testing the waters. She was testing to see what she could get away with. Now that she believed she had my full, passive compliance, she was going to escalate. Allée de ma maintenance. If you cut someone in half 1 year, and nobody stops you, you will inevitably try to make them disappear entirely the next year. I woke up on a crisp Tuesday morning in mid-November, poured myself a cup of dark coffee, and sat at my kitchen table. I opened my laptop. There, sitting at the very top of my inbox, was a new email from Clara. The subject line read, "Very important. Details for this year's Christmas family portrait." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I clicked open the email, and as I read through her completely absurd, dictatorial demands for the upcoming photo shoot, I did not feel angry. I felt a cold, absolute sense of clarity. The storm was finally here, and she had absolutely no idea who she was dragging into it. The email Clara sent out for this year's holiday photo shoot was 3 pages long. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking my dark coffee, and read through it twice, just to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. It was not a casual invitation. It was a production manifesto. She had decided that this year, the theme was going to be a classic, wealthy, vintage Christmas. She included a link to a digital presentation showing examples from high-end fashion magazines. She wanted the immediate family, meaning herself, David, and the younger cousins, in rich jewel tones, emerald greens, deep ruby reds, and stark, brilliant whites. And then there was a separate section, tucked away near the bottom of the email, specifically for the older relatives. For me, my sister-in-law Margaret, and a few others. She requested that we wear muted, flat colors, charcoal, dark slate, or heavy black. I stopped reading and looked up from my laptop. I stared at the blank wall of my kitchen. If you do not know anything about photography, you might just think she was being a little overly controlling about a color palette. You might think she just wanted the younger people to stand out. But I spent 40 years of my life inside the mechanics of an image. I know exactly how digital manipulation works. When you want to digitally remove a person from a photograph, the hardest part is not erasing the person. The hardest part is recreating the background behind them. If someone is standing in front of a complex pattern, like a bookshelf or a window with trees outside, erasing them leaves a messy, obvious blur. But if you position someone in front of a flat, solid, repetitive texture, and you make them wear a color that closely matches that texture, erasing them takes about 30 seconds. A basic clone tool just copies the empty wall and paints it right over their body. I thought about the massive, expensive, charcoal gray faux stone fireplace Clara had installed in her living room over the summer. And then I looked back at the email, requesting that I wear charcoal gray. She was not just pushing me to the edge of the frame this year. She was turning me into negative space. She was deliberately setting up the physical environment to make my digital assassination as smooth and seamless as possible. I did not call her to complain. I did not ask David why his wife was treating his mother like an unwanted prop. I simply went to a local department store, walked straight to the clearance rack, and bought the heaviest, most shapeless, flat charcoal gray wool sweater I could find. It was a terrible garment. It drained all the color from my face. That was exactly what she wanted. The day of the photo shoot was a Saturday in late November. Clara wanted the pictures taken early, so she would have plenty of time to meticulously edit and print them before the second week of December. When I arrived at their house, it felt like walking into a commercial film set. The heat was turned completely off, and the air conditioning was running full blast to combat the immense heat radiating from 3 massive, professional studio lights she had rented. David answered the door. He was wearing a stunning, tailored emerald green velvet jacket. But the moment I looked at his face, my heart completely shattered. He looked so incredibly tired. There were deep, purple shadows under his eyes. His posture was slumped. He gave me a hug, and it felt frail. It felt like hugging a man who was quietly suffocating under the weight of an illusion he never actually wanted to build. He looked at my terrible gray sweater, gave me a weak, apologetic smile, and led me into the living room. Clara was buzzing with a frantic, manic energy. She was wearing a brilliant crimson dress. She looked absolutely flawless, like a porcelain doll. She was barking orders at her cousins, adjusting the angle of a decorative throw blanket on a chair, and constantly checking the reflection in a large mirror. When she saw me, her eyes immediately scanned my outfit. I watched her register the dull, flat gray of the wool. I watched the corners of her mouth twitch upward into a tiny, genuine micro-expression of absolute victory. I had followed her instructions perfectly. I had made myself invisible. Ottoline, you look so cozy, she said, her voice dripping with that manufactured sweetness. Let us get everyone into position. I want to do this quickly. She corralled us all toward the massive charcoal fireplace. She placed David directly in the center, bathed in the brightest pool of artificial light. She stood next to him. Then, she began to arrange the rest of us. She did not put me on the edge this time. She put me in the back row. On the left side, standing directly in front of the flat, featureless expanse of the gray stone. Just tuck your arms in tightly. Ottoline, she instructed, walking over and physically pushing my shoulders closer together. We want to look like a really tight, close-knit family. Leave a little space between you and Uncle Robert. She was minimizing my physical footprint. She was creating a clear boundary between my body and the person standing next to me, ensuring our arms did not overlap. If our arms overlapped, erasing me would mean she would have to digitally reconstruct Robert's sleeve. She was making sure my entire outline was completely isolated against the dark gray stone. She stepped back. She adjusted one of the heavy light panels, turning it slightly away from my side of the room. I immediately felt the shadow fall across my face. She was removing the highlights from my skin, making me blend even further into the dark background. I stood there, freezing in the air conditioning, wearing a terrible sweater, deliberately hidden in the shadows of my son's house. Clara grabbed the remote trigger. She ran back to David. She threw her arms around him, tilted her head, and flashed a brilliant, blinding smile at the camera lens. The flash fired. The room lit up like lightning. The instant the shutter closed, Clara dropped her arms. She did not even look at David. She marched straight over to the digital monitor sitting on a table. I watched her from the shadows. I watched her stare at the raw image on the screen. I saw her eyes carefully trace the outline of my gray sweater against the gray stone. I saw her calculate the contrast. I saw her mentally drag the cursor over my face and erase me from existence. She turned around, looked directly at me, and let out a long and happy sigh. "Perfect," she said. "That is absolutely perfect. Thank you all so much for cooperating." She truly believed I had no idea what was happening. She thought I was just an old, compliant woman who did not understand the modern world. She thought she was the architect of a brilliant, flawless lie. I just smiled back at her, pulled my gray sweater tight around my shoulders, and waited for the post office to deliver the final proof. The moment the photo shoot was over, Clara did not just turn off the camera. She immediately shifted her entire personality. The frantic, dictatorial director vanished, and in her place stood the deeply concerned, incredibly attentive wife. This is the second phase of any major manipulation. In my 40 years of dealing with manipulated media, I learned that a fake photograph is only half the battle. If you want people to believe a lie, you have to give them a story that makes the lie feel necessary. You have to write a caption that completely recontextualizes what they are looking at. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The artificial lights in the living room had given me a slight headache, and the heavy gray wool sweater was suffocating. David followed me a few minutes later, but Clara intercepted him in the hallway right outside the kitchen archway. They were standing perhaps 5 feet away from me. I was pouring water from the refrigerator dispenser, and they could not see me from where they stood. I did not try to hide, but I did not announce myself either. I just stood there and listened to Clara construct the narrative of my erasure. "David, honey, look at me," Clara said. Her voice was pitched low, soft, and dripping with an entirely manufactured empathy. "Are you okay? You look so stressed." I heard David let out a long, heavy sigh. "I am just tired. Clara, work has been a lot, and this whole production. It just feels like a lot of pressure for a holiday card." I know, she murmured. I could hear the rustle of her silk dress. She was likely rubbing his arm, soothing him, playing the role of his only safe harbor in a stressful world. But I am doing this for us, for our future. And speaking of which, I really think we need to talk about your mother. I stopped drinking my water. I set the glass down on the granite counter without making a single sound. What about her? David asked. His voice sounded defensive. But it was a weak, hollow kind of defense. It was the voice of a man who was already too exhausted to win a fight. Did you look at her out there today? Clara asked. Her tone laced with tragic concern. She looked so drained. David. She is getting older. The bright lights, the standing around in the cold air conditioning, the constant posing, it is just too much for her. I feel terrible making her do this. It was a brilliant lie. It was completely inverted reality. She was the one who had turned the air conditioning on full blast. She was the one who bought the blinding studio lights. She was the one who physically pushed me into the shadows. And now, she was using the exact discomfort she had created as proof that I was too frail to participate. She is fine. Clara, David said softly. She has always been strong. Physical strength is one thing, Clara countered smoothly, but she just does not fit into this world. David, think about the people we are sending this card to. The senior partners at your firm, the investors we met in October. We are trying to project an image of a young, dynamics, forward-moving family. A family focused on the future. There was a brief silence. I could picture Clara looking up at him with those wide, calculated eyes. I am just saying, she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Maybe for the primary mailing list, the business contacts, the important friends we just use, the shot of us. Just the two of us, looking strong and successful. We can print a completely different, smaller batch of cards for the older relatives with your mother in it. But for the main list, we need to protect our brand. David. And honestly, we need to protect her from the stress of trying to keep up with us. She was boxing him in. She was wrapping my exclusion in the warm, fuzzy blanket of concern. If David argued to include me, she would accuse him of being insensitive to my age and my energy levels. If he agreed to exclude me, he would be betraying his own mother. But Clara knew exactly how tired he was. She knew he did not have the energy to argue about multiple printing batches or mailing lists. I do not know. Clara, David whispered. It feels wrong to just cut her out of the main card. We are not cutting her out, Clara said immediately. Her tone was sharp for a fraction of a second before returning to that sickly sweetness. We are just curating the audience. It is what PR professionals do every single day. You want to make partner next year, right? You want to look like the future of the firm? Let me handle the image. Let me take this burden off your shoulders. You just focus on your work. And let me manage the family aesthetic. I stood in the sterile white kitchen, staring at the cold condensation building on the outside of my water glass. I did not feel angry at David. I felt a profound, crushing sorrow for him. He was a smart man, but he was completely outmatched by someone who viewed human relationships as nothing more than a marketing campaign. He was too close to the picture to see the frame she was building around him. Okay, David finally whispered. The sound of his surrender was the quietest, saddest thing I had heard in years. Okay. Clara, whatever you think is best, thank you. Honey, she said. I heard her kiss his cheek. I promise. When the cards arrive, you will see exactly what I mean. It is going to be perfect. I picked up my water, took a slow sip, and walked out into the hallway. They both jumped slightly when I appeared, but I kept my face entirely relaxed. I gave them a warm, completely empty smile. I think I am going to head home now, I said smoothly. The traffic gets terrible around 4 o'clock. and I have a few things to take care of." Clara practically glided over to me. Her eyes were shining with the absolute thrill of her recent victory. She had secured David's permission. She had successfully rewritten reality. "Oh, Ottoline, are you sure?" she asked, grabbing my hands in hers. Her skin was freezing cold. "You did such a wonderful job today. Get some rest. Okay? You look like you really need it." "I will," I replied, looking directly into her eyes. "I have a lot of rest planned for the next few weeks. I am just going to sit back and see how everything develops." She smiled brilliantly, completely missing the darkroom metaphor. She thought I was going home to knit and take naps. She had no idea I was going home to prepare for a war. 2 weeks went by. For 14 days, I did not hear a single word from Clara about the photographs. I did not ask. And she did not volunteer any information. She was completely absorbed in the logistics of her own lie. The first week of December arrived, and with it came an invitation to a small, highly exclusive holiday kickoff cocktail party at their house. Clara called it a casual gathering. But nothing Clara ever did was actually casual. It was a calculated display of power. She invited about 40 people, mostly the senior partners from David's law firm, a few highly influential neighbors, and a very small, carefully selected handful of family members. I was on the guest list. I knew exactly why I was invited. Clara did not want me there because she enjoyed my company. She wanted me there so I could bear witness to the new kingdom she had built. She wanted me to stand in the corner of her pristine house and watch her operate as the absolute, undisputed matriarch of the family. I wore a simple, dark navy dress. I drove to their house on a freezing Friday evening, handed my coat to a hired server at the door, and walked into the living room. The house smelled like fresh pine needles and expensive champagne. A string quartet was playing softly in the corner. The lighting was dimmed to a warm, flattering glow. And right in the center of the room, holding court like a queen, was Clara. She was wearing a stunning, floor-length white silk dress. She looked absolutely radiant. In my 40 years of working with images, I have seen a lot of people try to project confidence. Politicians, celebrities, corporate executives. But there is a very specific, undeniable kind of glow that radiates from a person who truly believes they have gotten away with something terrible. It is a deeply arrogant, terrifying kind of joy. Clara had that glow. She was floating from group to group, her laugh carrying over the music, her hand lightly touching the arms of powerful men and wealthy women. She was entirely in her element. She thought she had successfully re-engineered reality, and nobody had stopped her. She mistook my quiet presence near the fireplace for absolute, final submission. She believed, with the complete certainty of someone who has never faced a real consequence in her life, that she had won. I stood near the edge of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, and I just watched her. About an hour into the party, I noticed a stack of thick, heavy, gold-embossed envelopes sitting on a silver tray near the front door. They were the holiday cards. Clara had printed them, sealed them, and had them ready to hand-deliver to the most important guests as they left the party. The rest, I assumed, were already moving through the postal system. I watched as the wife of a senior partner, a woman draped in heavy, very expensive diamond jewelry, walked up to Clara near the hallway. I was standing perhaps 10 feet away, partially hidden by a massive floral arrangement. "Clara, darling, the house looks absolutely spectacular," the woman said, holding a martini glass. "And I see you have your holiday cards ready. I cannot wait to open ours." Clara gave her a brilliant, practiced smile. She reached over to the silver tray, picked up one of the heavy envelopes, and handed it to the woman with both hands, like she was delivering a sacred text. "We are just so thrilled with how they turned out this year," Clara said, her voice dripping with that manufactured sweetness. "We really wanted to focus on a clean, modern aesthetic. Just David and I. Looking toward the future. You know how it is. Sometimes you just have to trim the excess to really let the core of the family shine." I stood perfectly still. Trim the excess. That was what I was to her. Excess. The woman smiled, completely unaware of the poison hidden inside that sweet little sentence. "Oh, absolutely. Family dynamics can be so exhausting during the holidays. It is smart of you to just keep it simple." "Exactly," Clara breathed, placing a hand over her heart. "And David's mother? Well, she is getting older. The whole production of a big family photo is just too stressful for her these days. I honestly felt terrible, even asking her to participate last year. This is just so much healthier for everyone." It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was standing in her $1 million home, wearing white silk, casually erasing me from my own family's history, and painting herself as a saint for doing it. I looked across the room. David was standing near the kitchen island. He was wearing a tailored suit, but he looked completely hollowed out. He was holding a glass of dark liquor, staring blankly at the floor, while two corporate lawyers talked loudly over him. He was a prop in her perfect life. He had traded his authenticity for an aesthetic, and it was slowly killing his spirit. I did not walk over and confront Clara. I did not cause a scene in front of the senior partner's wife. I did not knock the silver tray of fake photographs onto the floor. I just took a slow sip of my water. In photography, once you press the shutter, the moment is locked. You cannot unexpose the film. You cannot take the light back. Clara had pressed the shutter on this massive argent lit. She had handed the envelopes to her husband's bosses. She had dropped them in the mail to our relatives. She had locked herself into a narrative that she could no longer control. She was enjoying her false triumph. She was drinking champagne and accepting compliments, entirely unaware that she was standing on a trapdoor, and she had just handed me the lever. I stayed at the party for exactly 1 more hour. I smiled at the people I knew. I complimented the catering. When it was time to leave, I walked up to Clara, who was standing near the door. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Clara," I said. My voice was completely steady. "Everything looks perfect." "Oh, Ottoline, thank you for coming." She beamed, leaning in to give me a completely cold, fake embrace. "Drive safely, and keep an eye on your mailbox next week. The cards are on their way. I will be watching for it." I replied softly, "I cannot wait to see what you have done." I walked out into the freezing December air, got into my car, and drove back to my quiet, Messu, authentic house. I went to sleep perfectly calm. I knew the waiting was almost over. The very next afternoon, the mail truck pulled up to my driveway. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a freezing and wet Thursday when the mail truck pulled up to my driveway. I watched the carrier drop a thick bundle of letters into my box through the living room window. The rain was coming down in heavy, icy sheets, turning the world outside into a messy, blurred wash of gray. I put on my slippers, walked out to the end of the driveway with an umbrella, and brought the stack of mail inside. Sitting right on top of the pile was a heavy, square, cream-colored envelope. I did not even need to look at the return address. I recognized the impossibly perfect commercially printed faux calligraphy instantly. It was the exact same expensive font Clara had used for her curated Thanksgiving invitations. I walked into my kitchen. I set my damp umbrella by the door. I placed the rest of the mail on the granite counter. I did not rush. I took a very slow, very deliberate breath, slid my thumb under the heavy gold foil seal of the envelope, and pulled the card out. I spent 40 years of my life inside the architecture of an image. I have looked at tens of thousands of photographs. I have seen war zones digitally altered to look more dramatic. I have seen political rallies manipulated to look more crowded. I have seen every possible trick a human being can use to bend reality to their will. But seeing yourself completely erased from your own family is a very different kind of experience. I held the heavy cardstock under the bright overhead lights of my kitchen, and I just stared at it. There was the massive charcoal gray fireplace. There was David, standing dead center in his emerald green velvet jacket, looking hollow and exhausted. There was Clara, in her brilliant crimson dress, leaning into him with that blinding, predatory smile. There were the younger cousins, arranged perfectly in their jewel tones. And on the far left side, where I had stood freezing in a terrible gray wool sweater just 3 weeks prior, there was absolutely nothing. I was gone. I was not cropped out on the edge like last year. I was eradicated. If Clara were a professional editor, I might not have noticed the mechanics of her lie right away. But Clara was not a professional. Clara was an arrogant amateur who relied on basic software and the assumption that everyone else in the world was too stupid to look closely. I walked over to the kitchen drawer, pulled out a magnifying loupe, the exact same heavy glass loupe I used to use on light tables back in the newsroom, and placed it directly over the photograph. Through the magnified glass, her digital crimes were glaringly, embarrassingly obvious. When you want to remove a person from a digital image, you use a tool called a clone stamp. It allows you to select a piece of the background and paint it over the object you want to hide. But if you do not know what you are doing, you end up copying the exact same texture over and over again. I looked at the charcoal stone exactly where my chest and head should have been. I could see a very specific, jagged little white scratch in the faux stone pattern. Because Clara had just blindly dragged the digital brush across my body. That exact same jagged white scratch was repeated 4 separate times in a perfectly straight, unnatural vertical line. Then, I looked at Uncle Robert. Clara had instructed me to stand incredibly close to him, but not touching. She wanted a clean border, but she was clumsy. When she erased my right arm, she had accidentally erased the entire left edge of Robert's dark suit jacket. To fix it, she had tried to draw his arm back in, but she used the wrong shade of black brick. And worse, she completely ruined the lighting. In the real room, the harsh studio light was coming from the right side, casting a shadow on Robert's left side. But in Clara's edited version, Robert's reconstructed left arm was glowing with a flat, artificial brightness that made absolutely no sense given the physics of the room. He looked like his arm was radiating its own light. It was a butcher job. It was a sloppy, arrogant, amateurish piece of digital vandalism. I lowered the magnifying glass. The kitchen was completely silent, except for the sound of the icy rain hitting the window above the sink. I did not feel angry. Anger is a hot, messy emotion, and hot emotions make you careless. What I felt was a profound, chilling sense of clarity. I thought about the physical act of what she had done. I thought about Clara sitting at her pristine white desk in her sterile gray house. I thought about her pulling up this image on her computer screen. She had to zoom in on my face. She had to manually select the tool. She had to hold down the button on her mouse and physically drag the cursor back and forth across my eyes. across my smile, across my body, watching me disappear pixel by pixel until there was nothing left but a fake, repeating wall of gray stone. That is not an accident. That is not a printing error. That requires a very specific, very cold kind of malice. It requires you to look directly at a human being, a member of your own family, and decide that their existence is an unacceptable flaw in your aesthetic. She had handed this manufactured lie to her husband's wealthy partners. She had mailed it to our entire extended family. She had rewritten the fundamental truth of who we were, simply because she felt like it. I walked over to the refrigerator. I took down the card from last year, the one where I was sliced in half, and I placed it on the counter right next to the new one. The progression was undeniable. She was testing the fences. She was seeing how much of reality she could consume before someone finally told her no. She thought I was weak. She thought I was oblivious. She thought she could just paint over me, and I would quietly fade into the background like a good, compliant old woman. I picked up both photographs. I carried them down the hallway to my study. I turned on the small desk lamp, sat down in my heavy leather chair, and opened my laptop. Clara had spent her entire adult life curating an illusion. She thought a photograph was just a pretty picture. She did not understand that a photograph is a piece of evidence, and she had just mailed the absolute proof of her manipulation to my front door. I picked up my phone. It was time to stop observing and start investigating. I needed the original file. I needed the raw, unedited truth. And I knew exactly who to call to get it. Clara loved to brag. It was her greatest weakness. And in the end, it was the exact thing that gave me the weapon I needed to tear her illusion completely apart. During the photo shoot, she had mentioned the photographer's name at least half a dozen times. She wanted everyone to know she had hired Julian Vance, a young, very trendy, very expensive photographer who ran a high-end boutique studio right in the center of the city arts district. She spoke about him like he was a luxury handbag she had just purchased. I sat in my study, listening to the freezing rain hit the glass, and dialed his studio number. A young assistant answered. I did not ask for Clara's gallery. I did not sound like a confused grandmother trying to find a picture. I spoke with the exact, measured authority of a woman who had spent 40 years commissioning photographers across the globe. This is Adeline Ellsworth, I said smoothly. I am a former senior editor for the Associated Press. I need to speak with Julian regarding the raw files from the Ellsworth family holiday shoot. The assistant hesitated for barely 3 seconds before putting me through. When Julian picked up the phone, he sounded guarded. Professional photographers are incredibly protective of their unedited files. They do not like giving out raw data because it shows their mistakes before they can fix them. Ms. Ellsworth, he said carefully, Clara is the primary client on that contract. I usually only release final, edited JPEGs to the person who signed the agreement. So Satan did ... I understand that. Julian, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly calm and entirely professional. But I also know that you trained under Marcus Thorne in Chicago about 8 years ago. Marcus and I worked together during the '94 midterm elections. He is a brilliant man. He taught you well. There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the shift in his posture. I was no longer just a client's elderly mother-in-law. I was industry royalty. I was a colleague. You worked with Marcus? Julian asked. His voice entirely different now. Softer. Respectful. For nearly a decade. I said, Julian, I am putting together a private, unedited family archive for my son. I do not want the color-corrected because curated files. I want the heavy, uncompressed raw data from the camera sensor the exact moment the light hit the lens. I know Clara paid for the retouched package. But I need the original truth of that afternoon. He did not argue. He did not ask for Clara's permission. When you speak the language of a craftsman, they respect you more than the person who just writes the check. I will send a secure transfer link to your email right now. Ottoline, he said quietly. Keep it strictly between us. You have my word. I told him. 5 minutes later. A heavy digital folder arrived in my inbox. I did not open it on my small laptop screen. I walked over to my professional workstation in the corner of the study. It is a massive, color-calibrated monitor sitting on a heavy oak desk. I turned it on. Let the system warm up, and downloaded the files. People who do not work in digital media think a photograph is just a picture. They think it is a flat, simple thing. They do not realize that a digital photograph is actually a massive, incredibly detailed database of mathematical information. I imported the files into my editing software. I bypassed the images entirely and went straight into the EXIF data. The metadata, the digital fingerprint that is permanently attached to every single picture taken on a modern camera. The metadata does not lie. It does not have an ego. It just records the absolute truth of reality. I looked at the data for the specific photograph Clara had chosen for the holiday card. The metadata told me that the picture was taken on November 20th at exactly 10:14 in the morning. It told me the exact focal length of the lens. It told me the exact temperature of the artificial studio lights she had rented. Then, I looked at the digital history of the file she had sent to the printing company. When you edit a photo and save it, the software leaves a footprint. It is like leaving muddy boots on a clean white rug. Clara had not asked Julian to remove me from the photo. That was the first thing I realized. She could not ask him, because asking a professional photographer to digitally assassinate your mother-in-law is embarrassing. It leaves a witness. It makes you look petty and insane. Clara wanted to project perfection, and perfection cannot have witnesses to its construction. So, she had done it herself. The metadata on the printed file showed that it had been opened and heavily manipulated in a cheap, consumer-level editing program 3 days after the shoot. It was saved at 2:40 in the morning. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and just pictured it. I pictured Clara sitting in her pristine, sterile gray house in the dead of night. David was likely asleep down the hall. The house was completely quiet. And there she was, illuminated only by the cold blue light of her computer screen, desperately dragging a digital eraser over my face. Hour after hour, trying to reconstruct a fake stone wall, trying to literally wipe away the woman who had given birth to the husband she claimed to love. It was not just cruel. It was deeply, profoundly pathetic. I closed the metadata window and finally opened the visual files side by side. On the left side of my massive monitor was the original, raw photograph Julian had taken away. It was heavily shadowed because Clara had moved the lights away from me. But I was there. I was standing in my terrible gray wool sweater, my arms tucked in tightly, looking directly at the lens. I was a living, breathing, human being occupying physical space in my son's home. On the right side of the screen was the scanned copy of the holiday card Clara had mailed out. The exact same frame, but I was entirely gone, erased and replaced by a jagged, repeating pattern of fake charcoal stone and a digitally mangled jacket sleeve belonging to Uncle Robert. I looked back and forth between the truth and the lie. Clara thought she was a genius. She thought she was an unstoppable architect of reality. She had handed that piece of heavy, gold-foiled cardstock to the wives of senior law partners. She had mailed it to 40 different households. She was probably sitting in her kitchen right at this very moment, drinking an expensive green juice, feeling an immense, arrogant sense of relief that she had finally scrubbed me out of her aesthetic. She had no idea that I was sitting in my study, holding the absolute, undeniable mathematical proof of her insanity. She had given me the weapon. She had loaded the chamber. She had even pointed it at her own carefully curated life. All I had to do now was decide exactly when to pull the trigger. I sat in my study with my massive monitor illuminating the dark room. I had the two images open side by side. On the right was Clara's mass-produced, heavily manipulated lie. On the left was the heavy, uncompressed, absolute truth. I knew exactly what my next step had to be. If I simply emailed the raw file to the family, it would not have the necessary impact. Digital things are entirely too easy to dismiss. People look at an image on their tiny phone screens for 2 seconds and then scroll past it. Furthermore, if I sent it digitally, Clara could easily invent a lie to cover her tracks. She could claim my file was a mistake, or a corrupted draft from the photographer, or a weird computer virus. I needed physical evidence. I needed something heavy, undeniable, and permanent. I needed to fight her cheap, glossy illusion with absolute, uncompromising quality. The next morning, I put on my coat and drove into the city. It was a freezing, bitter Friday. The streets were covered in a thin layer of gray slush. I did not go to a commercial print shop. I drove to a small, incredibly exclusive fine art printing studio run by an old colleague of mine named Marcus. Marcus and I had worked together back in the late 90s when I was curating massive photojournalism gallery exhibitions. He is a master printmaker. He does not print holiday cards. He prints historical records. I walked into his studio. It smelled exactly the way a real photography lab should smell, like high-grade archival ink and heavy cotton paper. Marcus was surprised to see me, but he warmly welcomed me into his back room. I handed him the flash drive with Julian's raw file. I told him I needed 12 prints. Just 12. I did not want the flimsy, reflective, gold-foiled cardstock Clara had used. I told Marcus to use heavy, museum-quality, archival matte paper, the kind of paper that absorbs ink so deeply the image looks like it is physically embedded in the fibers, the kind of paper that is designed to last for 100 years without fading. Marcus pulled the file up on his own color-calibrated screen. He didn't ask questions about why my daughter-in-law had shoved me into the dark corner of the frame. He just looked at the lighting. With a few highly skilled, subtle adjustments, he lifted the heavy, artificial shadows Clara had deliberately cast over my face. He did not alter the reality of the room. He did not change the physical space. He simply restored the light that she had tried to steal from me. When the first print rolled out of his massive, professional plotter, I just stood there and stared at it. It was absolutely breathtaking. It was not a sterile, perfectly curated advertisement for a fake life. It was a picture of a family, a real, breathing, slightly disconnected family, standing in a freezing living room. And I was right there. I was standing in my terrible gray wool sweater, anchoring the left side of the frame, looking directly into the lens. My existence was completely undeniable. I paid Marcus in cash. I carefully placed the 12 heavy prints into a black portfolio case, carried them back to my car, and drove home. That evening, I sat at my dining room table and carefully planned the distribution. I did not need to send the picture to everyone on Clara's massive 40-person mailing list. I did not care about her wealthy neighbors or the senior partners at David's law firm. I only cared about the load-bearing pillars of our own family, the people whose opinions Clara desperately needed in order to validate her position as the new matriarch. I wrote down 12 names. My sister-in-law, Margaret, was at the very top of the list. Margaret is a fiercely intelligent woman with an absolute zero-tolerance policy for fake people. Uncle Robert was next. He needed to see exactly what his digitally amputated and glowing left arm was actually supposed to look like. Then, I added a few of the senior aunts and older cousins, the exact people Clara had been trying to silently push out of her curated aesthetic. I took out my heavy black fountain pen. I did not write a manifesto. I did not write a long, angry letter explaining what Clara had done. If you have to shout to explain a lie, you completely lose the quiet power of the evidence. You have to let the evidence speak for itself. On the back of each archival, museum-quality print, I simply wrote a warm, completely standard holiday greeting, wishing you and yours a beautiful, authentic Christmas. With all my love, Ottoline. That was it. Just the absolute truth of my presence, wrapped up in a perfectly polite holiday wish. I slipped the prints into 12 thick, textured envelopes. I wrote the addresses by hand in dark ink. I placed a stamp on every single one, but I did not drop them in the mailbox that day. In my line of work, timing is the difference between a minor correction and a massive, career-ending scandal. If I mailed the envelopes too early, Clara would undoubtedly get wind of it. She would have days to spin a narrative, play the victim, and manipulate David into defending her. I needed these envelopes to land in the mailboxes of our relatives exactly 48 hours before the massive Christmas Eve dinner Clara was hosting at her house. I needed the truth to arrive precisely when everyone was packing their bags and getting ready to travel. I needed the realization to hit them right before they walked through her front door. So, I stacked the 12 envelopes neatly on the corner of my desk, and I waited. During that week of waiting, Clara actually called me twice. She was riding the absolute high of her false triumph. She thought her own holiday cards had successfully rewritten the family hierarchy. Her voice over the phone was entirely relaxed, dripping with a sickeningly sweet, magnanimous tone. Ottoline, I hope you received our card. She chirped during the second phone call. The postal service has been so rough lately. I just hope it did not get bent in the mail. We have been getting so many wonderful compliments on it. I got it. Clara, I replied. My voice was entirely smooth. It arrived in perfect condition. It is a very striking image. You really captured exactly what you were aiming for. Oh, thank you, she breathed, letting out a little victorious laugh. She was so blinded by her own arrogance that she completely missed the double meaning of my words. She truly believed I had looked at my own erasure and simply accepted it as a printing error. I will see you on Christmas Eve. Clara, I said softly, we cannot wait to have you. She replied. I hung up the phone. I looked at the stack of 12 envelopes sitting on my desk. The trap was set. The evidence was secured. Clara had spent the entire year carefully building a massive, fragile house of glass, and I was about to hand a hammer to every single person she invited inside. I did not leave the 12 envelopes in my own mailbox for the carrier to pick up. When you are dealing with a lie of this magnitude, you do not leave anything to chance. On Tuesday morning, exactly 48 hours before Clara's massive Christmas Eve dinner was scheduled to begin, I drove downtown to the main branch of the post office. It was bitterly cold. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the threat of snow. I walked up to the heavy blue steel collection box sitting on the concrete sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, holding the thick, textured envelopes in my gloved hands. In the darkroom, there is a very specific moment when a photograph goes from being a flexible piece of potential into a permanent piece of history. It is the moment you drop the paper into the fixer fluid. Once the fixer touches the chemical grain, the image is locked. You cannot add light. You cannot take light away. The truth of the frame becomes absolute. I opened the heavy metal door of the collection box. I dropped the 12 envelopes down the chute. I heard them hit the bottom with a solid, satisfying thud. The image was locked. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in watching someone enjoy a completely fabricated victory. If Clara had known what was quietly making its way through the postal sorting facilities across the city, she would have been hyperventilating into a paper bag. But she did not know. She was floating on the absolute highest peak of her false triumph. On Wednesday afternoon, the day before the party, she called me. I was sitting in my living room, drinking a cup of hot tea and reading a book. When my phone vibrated on the coffee table, I let it ring 3 times before I picked it up. Ottoline. Hi, Clara Kirpid. Her voice was incredibly fast, buzzing with the frantic, manic energy of a woman who was directing a theatrical production. I am just running around like crazy, confirming the final details for tomorrow night. The caterers are setting up the carving stations right now, and the house looks absolutely incredible. I am sure it does. Clara, I said, keeping my voice entirely smooth and warm. You always put so much effort into the presentation. I really do. She agreed, completely missing the irony in my statement. She actually sighed. A heavy, theatrical sigh meant to show just how burdened she was by her own perfection. Listen, I am just calling to coordinate arrival times. I have the senior law partners and the managing director of David's firm arriving right at 6 o'clock. I want them to have a very focused, uninterrupted 30 minutes of networking before the house gets, well, before it gets too crowded with family. I took a slow sip of my tea. She was not just managing the photographs anymore. She was managing physical space in real time. She was actively telling her husband's mother to delay her arrival so that she would not pollute the visual aesthetic of the first 30 minutes of the party. She wanted to present herself as an independent, wealthy socialite to the people who wrote David's paychecks. Before the messy reality of his actual family walked through the door. So, Clara continued, her voice dripping with that sickly, condescending sweetness, if you and Aunt Margaret and the others could aim to arrive closer to 6:30, or even 6:45, that would just be so helpful for the flow of the evening. It will be much less chaotic for you. Anyway, 6:30 sounds perfectly fine. Clara, I replied, I would not want to disrupt the flow of your evening. You are a lifesaver. Ottoline. She breathed. I will see you tomorrow. Wear something warm. It is supposed to snow. She hung up the phone. I sat in the quiet comfort of my home and just smiled. She truly believed she was moving chess pieces on a board. She thought she had successfully quarantined me to the later half of the evening, just like she had quarantined me to the edge of the Thanksgiving photo. And just like she had entirely erased me from the Christmas card, she thought she was the absolute master of her universe. She had no idea that I did not need to be in the room at 6 o'clock to disrupt her perfect evening. I had already sent my representatives. Thursday arrived. Christmas Eve. I did not put on a shapeless, terrible gray wool sweater. That sweater had served its purpose. It had given her the rope she needed to hang her own reputation. Tonight, I was not going to blend into the shadows. Tonight, I was going to be completely, undeniably visible. I went to my closet and pulled out a beautifully tailored, heavy wool blazer in a deep, rich shade of burgundy. I paired it with a crisp black silk blouse and my favorite silver necklace. I brushed my hair. I put on a subtle shade of red lipstick. I looked in the hallway mirror before I put on my winter coat. I did not look like a fading, compliant old woman who belonged in the margins of a photograph. I looked like a woman who had spent 40 years commanding rooms full of very powerful men. I looked like the actual matriarch of the Ellsworth family. I left my house at exactly 6 o'clock. The drive to their neighborhood took about 25 minutes. It had started to snow. Huge. Heavy. Silent flakes were falling across the windshield, dusting the dark roads in a pristine layer of white. The heater in my car was humming softly. I drove exactly the speed limit. I was not in a rush. I was entirely calm. In my mind, I was calculating the timeline. Aunt Margaret lives closer to the city. Her mail usually arrives around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Uncle Robert's mail usually arrives around noon. By the time I turned onto Clara's incredibly expensive, tree-lined street, the 12 heavy, museum-quality prints had been sitting in the hands of my relatives for at least 5 hours. They had opened the envelopes. They had looked at the absolute, unedited truth of the raw photograph. They had flipped the heavy cotton paper over and read my warm, polite holiday greeting written in dark fountain pen ink. And then they had likely walked over to their own refrigerators or their own mantelpieces and looked at the glossy, digitally amputated lie that Clara had mailed them 2 weeks prior. They had 5 full hours to process the sheer, unadulterated malice required to completely erase a mother from a family portrait. They had 5 hours to realize exactly who Clara really was behind her brilliant, practiced smiles and her expensive vanilla candles. I pulled up to the house at exactly 6:30. The property was blazing with artificial light. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles belonging to the senior law partners, but parked right along the street, exactly where Clara had instructed the less important guests to park. I saw Margaret's heavy SUV. Right behind it was Uncle Robert's dark sedan. They were already inside. I turned off the engine of my car. I sat in the silent, warm cabin for one final moment, watching the snow fall on the windshield. Clara had spent an entire year building a massive, fragile house of glass. She had locked the doors. She had polished the windows. She was inside right now, drinking champagne, completely certain that her perfectly curated reality was safe. I picked up my purse, opened the car door, and stepped out into the freezing December night. It was time to hand them the stones. I walked up the heavily salted, perfectly shoveled walkway to Clara's front door. The snow was falling faster now, thick and heavy. Clinging to the branches of the expensive landscaping, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a jazz trio playing somewhere inside the house. I did not ring the doorbell. I simply turned the heavy brass handle and let myself in. The blast of warm air hit me the moment I crossed the threshold. The house smelled incredibly rich, a mixture of roasted winter vegetables, expensive catering, chafing, fuel, and the sharp, piney scent of massive, professionally decorated garlands draped over every doorway. The foyer was packed with people holding crystal glasses, their voices blending into a loud, sophisticated hum. I stood on the marble entryway, brushing the snow off the shoulders of my burgundy wool blazer. Within 30 seconds, Clara spotted me. She detached herself from a group of men wearing expensive tailored suits, likely the senior partners David worked for, and practically glided across the floor toward me. She was wearing a stunning, floor-length emerald green gown. Her hair was pulled back into an immaculate, complicated twist. She looked like a cover model for a luxury lifestyle magazine, and her face was absolutely radiating with the arrogant, blinding joy of a woman who believes her universe is completely under her control. "Ottoline, you made it," she breathed, reaching out to grasp my forearms with her freezing, manicured hands. She leaned in, keeping her voice low and conspiratorial. Thank you so much for waiting. The initial rush was just so chaotic. And the managing director had so many questions about David's new portfolio. It is just so much calmer now. She was thanking me for knowing my place. She was thanking me for staying in the shadows until the important people had been properly managed. It is perfectly fine. Clara, I said, keeping my voice entirely smooth. I looked directly into her eyes. I would not have missed this evening for the world. Let me have someone take your coat. She chirped. She signaled to a hired attendant in a crisp white shirt. As I handed my heavy winter coat away, Clara kept her hand lightly on the small of my back. Attempting to physically guide me away from the center of the room, she was trying to steer me toward the back corner of the living room, exactly where she had placed the older, less aesthetically useful family members. David is just wrapping up a conversation in the study, she said, her voice dripping with that manufactured sweetness. Why don't you go grab a plate from the carving station? Aunt Margaret is sitting by the fireplace. Thank you. Clara, I replied. I think I will go say hello to Margaret right now. I stepped away from her guiding hand. I walked slowly through the crowded, beautifully lit house. In my 40 years of working in newsrooms, I learned how to read a room before anyone ever spoke a word. You do not look at the people who are talking loudly. You look at the people who are silent. You look at the micro-expressions. You look at the physical distance people put between themselves and the person they are listening to. I scanned the party. The wealthy neighbors and the law partners were entirely oblivious. They were drinking champagne, eating catered hors d'oeuvre, and laughing loudly at each other's jokes. But the family, the 12 people who had received a heavy, museum-quality print in their mailboxes just a few hours prior, were operating on a completely different frequency. I saw Uncle Robert first. He was standing near the massive charcoal fireplace, holding a glass of dark red wine. He was talking to a younger cousin. But his posture was completely rigid. Every few seconds, his eyes would dart across the room to where Clara was standing, and his expression would darken into a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. He was not looking at the flawless host of a beautiful party. He was looking at a woman who had digitally amputated his arm and erased his sister from a family portrait just to make her living room look prettier. Then, I found Margaret. My sister-in-law was sitting on a plush armchair in the corner of the room. She was wearing a sharp, tailored black dress. Margaret is a woman who spent 35 years working as a high school principal in a very tough district. She does not tolerate nonsense. She does not tolerate disrespect. And she absolutely does not tolerate a liar. I walked over to her. Margaret did not smile when I approached. She just looked at me. Her eyes dropped to my burgundy blazer, and then back up to my face. She reached down to the heavy leather handbag sitting near her feet. She did not open it, but she lightly tapped the side of it with her index finger. I knew exactly what was inside that bag. The heavy cotton paper. The unedited truth. You look beautiful tonight. Ottoline, Margaret said quietly. Her voice was incredibly calm, but it had the terrifying, heavy stillness of a hurricane sitting just offshore. Thank you, Margaret, I replied, sitting down on the sofa next to her chair. It is going to be a very memorable evening. Oh, I have no doubt about that, she murmured. Taking a slow sip of her wine, she looked across the room at Clara, who was throwing her head back in a practiced, brilliant laugh for the benefit of a senior partner. She has absolutely no idea, does she? She thinks she is the smartest person in the room. I said softly, Not for much longer, Margaret replied. I sat back and watched the party unfold. It was a masterclass in dramatic irony. Clara was floating through the room, pouring drinks, fixing the angle of the decorative napkins, completely high on her own false triumph. She thought the quiet tension radiating from the family was just awe. She thought they were intimidated by her wealth, by her perfectly dressed husband, by the sheer scale of the event she had orchestrated. She mistook their silence for submission. She had absolutely no idea that they were not silent because they were impressed. They were silent because they were watching a dead woman walking as. About 20 minutes later, David finally emerged from the study. My heart broke a little when I saw him. He was wearing a stunning, tailored tuxedo. But he looked completely hollow. The skin around his eyes was gray. He looked like a man who had spent the last 12 months holding his breath. He saw me sitting with Margaret. He gave me a weak, exhausted smile and started walking toward us. But Clara intercepted him halfway across the room. She grabbed his arm, pulled him close, and whispered something in his ear. She pointed toward the center of the living room, right in front of the massive charcoal fireplace. She was directing him. She was setting the stage. It was time for her big moment. Every year, at exactly 7:30 on Christmas Eve, Clara made a speech. She loved speeches. She loved the sound of her own voice echoing in a room full of powerful people who were forced to listen to her. Clara picked up a silver spoon and lightly tapped the side of her crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the jazz music and the low hum of conversation. The room slowly quieted down. The law partners turned around. The neighbors stopped talking. And the 12 members of the Ellsworth family, scattered throughout the room, went completely, utterly still. Clara stood dead center in front of the fireplace, holding David's hand. The artificial lighting caught the emerald silk of her dress, making her look absolutely radiant. She beamed at the crowd. She took a deep, dramatic breath, ready to deliver her perfectly curated monologue about love, family, and the beautiful future she was building. She thought this was her crowning achievement. She thought she was untouchable. Margaret leaned slightly toward me. Her eyes locked onto Clara and whispered, "Here we go." Clara lowered her silver spoon from the crystal glass. The room was entirely silent now, save for the very faint crackle of the massive charcoal fireplace behind her. She looked out over the crowd of wealthy neighbors, powerful law partners, and the scattered members of our own family. She took a slow, theatrical breath. She looked at David, giving him a look of profound, manufactured adoration. And then she turned her brilliant smile back to the room. "I just want to take a moment to thank every single one of you for being here tonight." Clara began. Her voice was perfectly modulated. It was the exact tone of a woman who had practiced this speech in front of a mirror for a week. This has been an incredibly busy, wonderfully successful year for David and me. As we look toward the future, toward new milestones and new responsibilities, we are just so profoundly grateful for the foundation we are building together. I sat on the sofa next to Margaret, completely still. Clara was speaking directly to the senior partners now. She was selling them a product. The product was her husband, and she was the flawless packaging. "The holidays are a time for reflection," Clara continued, placing a hand lightly over her heart. "They are a time to strip away all the noise, all the clutter of the outside world, and focus on what is truly authentic, on the people who form the absolute core of your life, the people who stand by you, unedited and true." I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from letting out a laugh. Unedited and true. It was almost too perfect. She was so entirely consumed by her own lie that she was unknowingly writing the script for her own execution. "Many of you," Clara said, gesturing gracefully toward the silver tray of envelopes sitting near the front door, "have already received our family holiday card in the mail this week. Or you will be taking one home tonight. When we planned that photograph, I told the photographer that I did not want anything overly complicated. I just wanted a clean, focused picture of our family moving forward. Just us. Strong. United. And looking toward a bright new year." She squeezed David's hand. He looked at the floor. He did not look strong or united. He looked like a hostage. "So, please," Clara concluded, raising her champagne flute high into the air, "raise a glass with me. To authenticity, to focus, and to the beautiful, perfect family we choose to build. To family." The wealthy neighbors and the law partners echoed warmly. The sound of dozens of crystal glasses clinking together echoed through the high ceilings of the living room. Clara took a sip of her champagne. She lowered her glass, her face glowing with the absolute intoxicating thrill of her false triumph. She thought the performance was over. She thought the curtain had safely come down, and she had received her standing ovation. She turned slightly, intending to hand her empty glass to a passing waiter. That was when the heavy leather armchair next to me creaked. Margaret stood up. She did not stand up quickly. She stood up with the slow, deliberate, terrifying gravity of a judge walking into a courtroom. She smoothed the front of her sharp black dress. She reached down into her heavy leather handbag, and she pulled out the thick, textured envelope I had mailed her 2 days prior. The room was just starting to break out into casual conversation again. But the people standing closest to the fireplace noticed Margaret moving. Uncle Robert noticed. The 12 family members scattered around the room stopped completely, their eyes locking onto Margaret like a homing beacon. Margaret walked straight through the center of the living room. She did not weave through the crowd apologetically. She walked in a perfectly straight line, and the people standing in her way instinctively stepped aside. There is a certain kind of authority that you cannot buy with expensive emerald silk or catered hors d'oeuvre. It is the authority of a woman who has caught you in a lie and is coming to collect the debt. Clara noticed the shift in the room. She turned back around, the brilliant smile still frozen on her face. But her eyes flickered with a split second of confusion as Margaret approached her. "Aunt Margaret," Clara said, her voice a little higher than usual. "Is everything all right? The carving station is open if you are hungry." Margaret stopped exactly 3 feet away from Clara. She did not raise her voice. She did not sound angry. She sounded entirely, brutally calm. The speech was lovely. "Clara," Margaret said. Her voice carried beautifully over the soft jazz music, especially the part about being unedited and true. "I was actually hoping you could help me with a small point of confusion regarding that exact sentiment." Clara's smile tightened. She could feel the sudden, massive drop in the atmospheric pressure of the room. But she didn't know where the storm was coming from. "Of course." "Margaret, what is it?" Margaret held up the thick envelope. She slowly pulled out the heavy, museum-quality archival print. She did not show it to the crowd yet. She just held it in her hand. "I checked my mail before I drove over here tonight," Margaret said, looking directly into Clara's eyes, "and I received your lovely holiday card. The one with just you, David, and the cousins. It is a very striking image." "Oh, thank you," Clara breathed, the relief visibly washing over her face. She thought Margaret was just going to give her a compliment. "We are very proud of it." "Yes," Margaret continued smoothly. "But then, Right underneath it in my mailbox, I found a second envelope, and it contained a very different version of the exact same photograph. The entire living room went dead silent. The jazz trio in the corner awkwardly stopped playing. The managing director of David's law firm, who was standing just a few feet away, slowly lowered his martini glass. Clara Froze. The color drained from her cheeks in a rapid glaffly. Terrifying wave. Leaving her looking entirely gray, Margaret slowly turned the heavy cotton paper around, holding it up right under the bright artificial lights of the chandelier, so that Clara, David, and every single senior partner standing in the center of the room could see it clearly. There it was, the heavy, undeniable, uncompressed truth. There was the massive charcoal fireplace. There was David in his green jacket. There was Clara in her red dress. And standing firmly on the left side of the frame, occupying undeniable physical space in the universe, was me. I am just an old woman. Clara, Margaret said, her voice dripping with a quiet, lethal precision. So perhaps you can explain the technology to me. How does a person stand in a room, look directly at a camera, and then magically disappear from the photograph you handed to your husband's boss? Clara looked at the archival print. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked exactly like a driver who had just realized their brakes were completely and permanently defunct while speeding toward a concrete wall. She looked past Margaret. Her panicked, terrified eyes scanned the silent, staring crowd, and then her eyes found me. I was sitting on the sofa, bathed in the warm light of a table lamp, wearing my burgundy blazer. I did not look angry. I did not look hurt. I just looked at her, and I gave her a very small, very polite smile. The trap had officially snapped shut. Margaret stood under the warm glow of the living room chandelier, holding the thick, museum-quality print. Clara's mind was visibly racing. I could see the frantic calculations happening behind her eyes. She tried to smile. She tried to maintain the flawless, curated facade. But it was crumbling right in front of us. Margaret, I am not sure where you got that. Clara stammered. Her voice, usually so perfectly modulated and confident, was suddenly thin and reedy. It sounded like the voice of a very small, very frightened child. I got it in the mail. Clara, Margaret said calmly. It arrived yesterday afternoon, along with a very warm, handwritten holiday greeting from Adeline. Margaret reached back into her heavy leather handbag. She pulled out the second envelope, the one with the gold foil, the one Clara had proudly handed out at her cocktail party. Margaret held them both up, side by side, right in the center of the room. Two distinct versions of reality, presented for the entire crowd to see. This is the exact moment we arrived at in the very beginning of this story. The festive jazz music had awkwardly stopped. The room, packed with 30 of our closest relatives and all of David's wealthy business associates, had gone completely, utterly silent. Clara's hand was shaking so badly, she spilled a drop of her expensive champagne onto the polished marble floor. She looked at the two photographs. In one, we were a messy, real family. In the other, a glaring, poorly retouched, void of fake charcoal stone and a digitally mangled jacket sleeve sat exactly where I was supposed to be. Clara looked at me. Her face was completely drained of color. Just 10 minutes prior, she had been floating through this room, pouring drinks, basking in the glow of what she thought was her perfect, unassailable evening. She thought she had established absolute dominance over the family aesthetic. Now, She was cornered. And she knew it. I watched David. He had been staring at the floor during her speech. But when Margaret held up the pictures, he looked up. I saw his eyes track from the fake, glossy photograph to the heavy, unedited truth. I saw the exact moment the realization hit him. He didn't just realize that his mother had been erased. He realized the sheer, calculated malice it required. He realized that his wife had sat at a computer in the middle of the night, deliberately wiped his mother out of existence pixel by pixel, and then lied about it to his face, claiming she was just trying to protect my health. The color drained from David's face. 2. He slowly dropped Clara's hand. He took a physical half-step away from her. It was a tiny movement. But in a completely silent room, it was incredibly loud. It was the physical manifestation of a man's heart breaking. The managing director of the law firm was standing just a few feet away, holding a martini glass. These were men whose entire careers were built on evaluating character, detecting fraud, and managing liability. They were no longer looking at Clara as a flawless, charming socialite. They were looking at her as a deeply disturbed Betu, an incredibly clumsy liar. I saw the wife of a senior partner, the woman who had praised the holiday cards so highly a few weeks earlier, lean over and whisper something to her husband. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on Clara with a look of absolute professional horror. In their world, you can survive a lot of things, but you cannot survive being publicly exposed as a fraud in your own living room. It was a mistake. Clara whispered. Her voice was trembling so violently she could barely form the words. The printing company, they must have messed up the file. Do not insult my intelligence. Clara. Margaret cued in. Her voice sliced through the silence like a cold scalpel. I have known Adeline for 40 years. I know exactly what she did for a living. I know you did not accidentally crop her out. You digitally painted a fake wall over her face because you decided she did not look wealthy enough or perfect enough for your friends. Uncle Robert stepped forward from the fireplace. And you completely ruined my arm while you were doing it, he added, his voice thick with absolute disgust. You treated your own family like a set of cheap, disposables props. Clara was hyperventilating now. The fragile, beautiful house of glass she had spent a year building was shattering into a million pieces around her. There was nowhere to run. There was no PR spin that could fix this. The raw, unedited truth was literally in the hands of the people she feared losing the most. She looked at me again. She was waiting for the screaming to start. In her world, when someone is caught, there is a massive, dramatic explosion. There is yelling. There is name-calling. She was bracing herself for me to stand up, walk over to the center of the room, and completely destroy her. She was waiting for me to demand she be thrown out of her own house. She was waiting for the terrifying, righteous wrath of a mother scorned. The entire room was waiting for it. The relatives, the lawyers, David. They all turned their eyes away from the photographs and looked directly at me. They were waiting for me to deliver the final, crushing blow. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I did not look angry at all. I sat on the comfortable sofa, bathed in the warm light of a table lamp. Wearing my tailored burgundy blazer, I looked at this beautiful, absolutely terrified young woman who was so completely consumed by her own insecurities that she had tried to erase reality just to feel safe. She was waiting for me to act like a monster, because that would make it easier for her. If I screamed, she could play the victim. If I insulted her, she could cry and seek sympathy. But I am not a monster. I am a mother. And I am an editor. I knew that destroying her publicly would not fix the underlying image. It would just create a different kind of ugly picture. I took a slow breath, placed my hands neatly in my lap, and prepared to do the one thing she absolutely, entirely never expected. I stood up from the comfortable sofa. The soft creak of the leather cushions sounded incredibly loud in the dead, heavy silence of the living room. Every single pair of eyes in the house locked onto me. The senior law partners, the wealthy neighbors, my son. They all stopped breathing. They were waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for me to walk to the center of the room. Look at this terrified young woman in her emerald green dress, and tear her entirely to shreds. Margaret stood tall under the chandelier, holding the unedited photograph like a sword, fully prepared for me to deliver the final, killing blow. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor. I stopped right next to Margaret. I looked at the heavy, archival cotton paper in her hand. Then, I looked at Clara. Clara's eyes were wide, brimming with panicked tears. She was shaking so violently, I could actually hear the faint rustle of her silk gown. She squeezed her eyes shut and braced her shoulders, waiting for the screaming. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice at all. I reached out and gently pushed Margaret's hand down, lowering the photograph. That is quite enough. Margaret? I said softly. My voice was completely calm. Margaret looked at me, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp confusion. She had wanted absolute justice. But in my line of work, you learn very quickly that exposing a lie is only the first step. If you want to fix the underlying damage, you have to look at why the lie was created in the first place. I turned away from Margaret and looked out at the crowd of frozen, staring guests. Please, I said, offering the room a warm, entirely steady smile. Enjoy the music. The carving station smells wonderful. David, please ensure your managing director has a fresh drink. The senior partners blinked. The wealthy neighbors awkwardly shifted their weight. I was giving them permission to look away from the car crash. And in high society, people are always incredibly grateful for an excuse to ignore something ugly. The jazz trio, catching my cue, nervously started playing again. The low hum of forced conversation slowly began to fill the room. I turned back to Clara. I did not insult her. I did not point a finger. I simply reached out and placed my hand gently on her freezing forearm. Come with me, I whispered. I did not wait for her to answer. I kept my hand on her arm and slowly guided her away from the center of the room, away from the staring eyes of her husband's bosses, and down the long hallway toward the study. David took a step forward to follow us, his face a mixture of absolute shock and profound sorrow. But I caught his eye and gave him a single, firm shake of my head. I needed to do this alone. We walked into the dark, quiet study. I closed the heavy oak door behind us. The sound of the jazz music and the clinking champagne glasses was instantly muffled, leaving us in a thick, heavy silence. The moment the latch clicked shut, the flawless, curated illusion of Clara Ellsworth completely shattered. She did not just cry. She collapsed. She sank into a heavy leather armchair in the corner of the room, pulled her knees up to her chest, and began to sob with the ugly, hyperventilating, entirely unedited terror of a frightened child. The immaculate emerald silk pooled around her. Her expensive, complicated hairstyle started to come undone. I did not rush to comfort her. I walked over to the small lamp on the desk, clicked it on, and sat down in the chair across from her. I just let her cry. When you spend 40 years looking at manipulated images, You learn that people only edit the things they are deeply, profoundly afraid of. A person who feels secure does not need a filter. Clara had spent her entire adult life running a massive, exhausting PR campaign because she was terrified of what would happen if anyone saw the truth. After about 5 minutes, her sobbing finally slowed down to heavy, jagged breaths. She looked up at me. Her expensive mascara was running down her cheeks. She looked absolutely miserable. "I am so sorry," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I am so sorry. Ottoline, you must hate me." "I do not hate you, Clara," I said quietly, leaning forward and resting my hands on my knees. "But I need you to tell me the truth. Why did you erase me? And do not tell me it was about the lighting, or the aspect ratio, or the firm's aesthetic." She squeezed her eyes shut. The silence stretched out for a long, heavy moment. And then, the real truth finally spilled out. "Because I am not enough," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "I have never been enough." She looked down at her shaking hands. "You do not understand what it was like growing up the way I did," she continued, the words rushing out of her now like water from a broken dam. "My parents were a disaster. We had nothing. The only way I survived was by making sure nobody on the outside ever knew how broken we were on the inside. I learned that if everything looks perfect, people treat you like you are perfect. They respect you. They don't look closely enough to see the mess." I sat perfectly still and listened. "And then I met David," she sobbed. "I walked into your house for that very first dinner. And your family was just so real. You did not care if the plates matched. You did not care if the floor was scratched. You were completely secure in who you were. And it terrified me. Ottoline, it absolutely terrified me." She looked up at me, her eyes completely raw. "I felt like a fraud standing next to you," she confessed. "I felt like an imposter who had tricked your son into marrying me. I thought that if I could just build the perfect environment, if I could just curate the perfect house and the perfect clothes and the perfect pictures, I would finally feel like I belonged. But you were the one piece of reality I could not control. Every time I looked at you in a photograph, you looked completely comfortable in your own skin. And it just reminded me of how completely fake I am." She dropped her face into her hands and wept. She had not erased me because I was ugly, or old, or embarrassing. She had erased me because my absolute authenticity was a glaring spotlight on her profound insecurity. She was a woman drowning in artificial light, desperately trying to paint over the one person who remembered what the sun looked like. I looked at this beautiful, broken girl sitting in the leather chair. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I just felt a deep, overwhelming wave of compassion. I stood up from my chair. I walked over to her. I did not give her a polite, distant pat on the shoulder. I wrapped my arms around her trembling shoulders and pulled her into a tight, grounding embrace. She froze for a split second, completely shocked by the contact. And then she buried her face in my burgundy wool blazer and cried even harder. "Clara, listen to me," I murmured, keeping my voice incredibly soft but completely firm. In my 40 years in the darkroom, the most heavily retouched photographs always belong to the most frightened people. You cannot clone stamp away your pain. You cannot crop out your insecurities. It just creates a ghost. I pulled back slightly so I could look directly into her tear-streaked face. "You do not need to perform for us," I told her, holding her cold hands in mine. "You do not need to be a flawless socialite. You do not need to manage the aesthetic of this family to earn your place in it." David did not fall in love with a photograph. He fell in love with a human being. and you are allowed to just be a human being. Clara. Messy. Flawed. And entirely real. She looked at me, her chest heaving, her eyes searching mine for any sign of a trick, any sign of lingering anger. But there was none. There was just the quiet, absolute truth. The war is over. Clara, I whispered, you do not have to fight anymore. Just put the camera down. Come back to the real world. For the first time since I had met her, the frantic, terrified tension completely left her body. She let out a long, shaky breath, leaned her head against my shoulder, and finally, truly surrendered. When Clara and I finally walked out of that heavy oak door, we had been in the study for nearly 45 minutes. The jazz trio was still playing softly in the corner. The senior law partners were still drinking their champagne and talking loudly about their portfolios. But for Clara, the entire universe had completely shifted. She did not walk back into the center of the room to hold court. She did not run to the bathroom to fix her makeup. Her emerald silk dress was slightly rumpled. Her eyes were red, and her expensive mascara was visibly smudged. David was standing near the edge of the hallway, holding a glass of water, looking absolutely terrified. He thought his marriage was over. He thought I had just handed his wife a list of demands and a timeline for her exit. Instead, Clara walked straight up to him, dropped her arms around his waist, and buried her face in his shoulder. She did not care who was watching. She did not care about her posture. She just held onto her husband like he was a life raft. I watched David's shoulders drop. I watched him wrap his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, breathing out a sigh that looked like it had been trapped in his lungs for 5 long years. It was the very first time since I met them that they looked like a real, breathing couple, rather than 2 flat models in a luxury catalog. I walked quietly across the room and sat back down on the sofa next to Margaret. Margaret looked at the 2 of them standing in the hallway. She looked at me. She reached down, patted the heavy leather handbag where the unedited photograph was safely tucked away, and gave me a single, slow nod. The weapon was put away. The war was officially over. The transformation of the Ellsworth family did not happen overnight. You cannot undo 3 decades of deep, survival-based trauma and insecurity with one single conversation in a study. But the frantic, desperate need to curate reality was finally broken. A few weeks after that Christmas Eve party, Clara came over to my house alone. She did not wear a tailored silk blouse. She wore a pair of comfortable, faded jeans and a heavy sweater. We sat in my living room, on my terrible, bright orange sofa. We drank hot tea out of mismatched mugs, and for the very first time, she did not look at the scratch on the wooden floor with confusion or judgment. She just sat back, let her shoulders drop, and allowed herself to exist in the mess. By the time the next holiday season rolled around, their sterile, gray house had completely changed. Clara fired the expensive interior decorator. She let David bring his old, incredibly ugly leather recliner out of the basement and put it right in the middle of the living room. There were paperback books piled on the coffee table. There were shoes kicked off by the front door. It looked like a place where human beings actually lived. And then came Thanksgiving. We did not receive a 3-page email with a strict color palette. There were no rented studio lights. There was no professional photographer hired to capture our aesthetic. After we finished eating the turkey, David suggested we take a picture. Clara did not herd us toward the fireplace. She did not physically adjust my shoulders or try to push me into the shadows. She just grabbed her phone, propped it up against a ceramic bowl of fruit on the kitchen counter, and set a 10-second timer. We all scrambled to get into the frame, I was wearing a comfortable, incredibly bright blue sweater. Margaret was holding a glass of wine. Uncle Robert was laughing at a terrible joke David had just made. At the very last second, Clara sprinted around the kitchen island and dove into the group, throwing one arm around David and the other arm directly around my shoulders. The phone flashed. We all crowded around the small glowing screen to look at the result. It was a terrible photograph. Half of Uncle Robert was accidentally cropped out because the phone had slipped against the fruit bowl. Margaret was blinking. David had a very visible spot of gravy on the collar of his shirt, and the lighting was completely flat and unflattering. But Clara looked at that blurry, chaotic, completely unedited mess, and she smiled. She did not open a retouching app. She did not reach for a clone stamp tool to fix the background. She just sent the picture, exactly as it was, to a small group text of exactly 12 people, the people who actually mattered. I spent 40 years of my life in the darkroom, hunting for the truth inside a negative. I learned that you cannot force a picture to be perfect by blasting it with artificial light. All you do is blow out the highlights and destroy the texture, the beauty of an image, and the beauty of a family. Lives entirely in the contrast. It lives in the deep shadows, the messy edges, and the unvarnished truth of who is standing in the room with you. Sometimes, the absolute worst, most confusing behavior from the people we love does not come from malice. It comes from a profound, terrifying insecurity that desperately needs to be seen and understood, rather than simply punished. You do not have to accept the bad behavior, but you also do not have to destroy the person to stop it. You just have to show them that they are safe in the light. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you believe that a messy, authentic reality is always better than a perfect, curated illusion, please leave a comment and hit the subscribe button. I will see you